One of the key aspects of DSLR photography is exposure. And exposure is basically how light or how dark your image is. And in order to capture the images that you have in mind that you want to create, you have to understand exposure. So the question now is, what goes into exposure? How do I get the proper exposure? Well, there's three things that go into exposure. There's aperture, there's shutter speed, and there's ISO. And we'll cover all three of these things in depth. But just so you understand fundamentally, in order to get the perfect exposure, these three things are going to move in tandem to one another. So if you change shutter speed, now aperture and ISO are affected. If you change aperture, now ISO and shutter speed are affected. So these are the three things that go into exposure that get you the perfect image. It's not too bright, not too dark. They get you right in the middle and allows you for an image that you can work with in retouching, or something that is going to be nice right out of the box. So before we get started talking about the individual factors that go into exposure, like aperture and shutter speed and ISO, I wanted to touch quickly on how the mechanics of a camera work. So very briefly, you have a camera, right? And on the front of the camera, you have a lens. And everybody's familiar, I think most people know, on a camera, there's a button you push and that's how you take a picture. So what happens when you click that button? First thing that happens is that there's an opening in your lens the whole time. And when you click the button, light is allowed to pass through that lens and hit a sensor in the back of the camera. So you can see this little mirror in the camera. That's why a DSLR is called that. It's a digital single lens reflex, which means it has a mirror in here that allows you to see through the lens. So what happens when you press the button is the mirror flips up and it reveals this sensor. And in film, what would happen is the mirror would flip up and you'd see physical film. So you click the button, light passes through this lens, makes contact with the sensor, and how long that light hits that sensor is what determines your exposure. So let's talk about shutter speed. Shutter speed is the part that controls the duration, or the amount of time that light is allowed to hit the sensor, which is where the image is printed or captured. Shutter speed is always represented as a number, so 1/500, 1/2500. And that is literally the fraction of a second that is allowed for the light to come through the lens and hit the sensor. So remember, the sensor is behind this mirror and light passes through this lens. So if I leave the shutter open for a second, that means I'm letting a second worth of light come through and hit the sensor. If I leave the sensor open for 1/2500 of a second, that means an instant that light is passing onto the sensor. So just to demonstrate, I'll show you the fastest shutter speed this camera will do, and then I'll show you a slow one so you can see what's really going on inside the camera. So the first shutter that I'm going to show you is 1/8000 and show you how quick that really is. So hear that? That's so quick. Now, at the other end of the spectrum, we're going to do 1 second. It's going to seem like a lifetime comparatively. So you're basically having a full second of exposure on your image. So that's a big drastic difference, and you want to understand what those different ranges will deliver to your final image. So one of the great things about shutter speed is it sort of serves two purposes. One purpose, as we just talked about, is it'll control how much light is allowed to hit your sensor. So it can allow your image to look lighter or darker depending on how fast or how slow you manipulate the shutter speed. But the second thing it does, it allows you to freeze motion. So if you shoot with a faster shutter speed, you can freeze motion. However, if you want to see some motion in your image, a slower shutter speed will allow you to obtain that. For instance, you're trying to shoot a friend walking across the street and you want to freeze that motion, you might want to be in a shutter range of 1/250 to 1/500. And you might be able to physically hand hold that camera and really get a good frozen, sharp image of somebody walking. Now, if you want to catch something like a car or somebody running or jogging, you're going to need to shoot a little bit faster. And that range is probably going to be around 1/1000, 1/2500, or maybe even a little faster. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, if you want to show a little blur but also keep your subject sharp, you might be somewhere in the range of 1/30. Say you're taking a picture of a beautiful waterfall and you want to make the water look smooth and silky, you might be at half a second. You might be at a full second. And if you're taking a picture at night and you want to show a beautiful skyline with the stars twinkling and be able to capture sort of lights moving as they drive through highways or intersections and see that light trail, you're going to want to shoot even slower, maybe at 30 seconds exposure. So you can use shutter speed all along the spectrum to capture some really cool and creative photos, but it's about knowing those typical ranges and being able to hone in on that allow you to really take control of the camera and the picture that comes out of as a result of it. The other benefit of shutter speed is it allows you to negate the impact of camera shake. So for instance, I'm holding a camera right now and it's not on, but if I hold this camera for 2 or 3 seconds, you'll notice, or at least I can notice up close, that the camera shakes a little bit. It's not perfectly steady. And the faster you shoot an image, the less that becomes a factor. The slower you shoot an image, the more likely you're to be susceptible to the camera shake and seeing that on the final image. So remember that not only can shutter speed help you in controlling your exposure, it can also help you with getting rid of camera shake. It can help you freeze motion. It can also help you show motion in an image. So it's got a lot of impact that it can have on the final image that you're trying to shoot. So the next thing I want to talk about is aperture. And aperture is basically the size of the opening through which light passes through the lens. Now, how does that have an effect on exposure? Well, the bigger the opening in the lens, the more light will pass through. And the smaller the opening in the lens, the less light will pass through. So directly impacts whether the image will be dark or light. Now, aperture is denoted as a number as well, and it's called the f-stop. The f-stop controls the size of the opening. It's going to sound a little counterintuitive, but the smaller the number, the bigger the opening. And the bigger the number, the smaller the opening. So this lens is a 24-70 2.8, meaning 2.8 is the maximum aperture, meaning the biggest opening that the lens can have. So thinking about the final image, if I shoot this at 2.8, all other things not being considered, I'm going to have a lot of light or a brighter image. And if I shoot this at f22, the same lighting conditions, I'm going to have a darker image as a result. So not only can you use aperture to help control the exposure of your image, you can also use aperture to help with sort of the creative aspects of your image. One of the things that gets mentioned a lot with aperture is depth of field. And let's do it in layman's terms. Depth of field is basically how blurry the picture ends up being beyond the thing that you're pointing the camera at. So if I'm shooting a picture of a person right in front of me and I focus on their face and I want their face to be really sharp and crisp, what does the rest of the image look like beyond that person? Is it really blurry? Is it in focus? And that's basically our depth of field. The more blurry the image becomes beyond the subject is the more shallow the depth of field is. If the image behind that subject is really sharp and in focus, we'll say that depth of field isn't very shallow. When you're using a camera, let's just use this 2.8 maximum aperture lens as an example. If I'm shooting at 2.8, the maximum aperture or the widest opening, if I take a picture of the person in front of me and I focus on their face, everything behind them will start to look blurry because at 2.8, with the opening being so wide, everything is going to fall out of focus beyond the subject. Now, if I turn my f-stop to f22 and go really, really sharp, things behind that person are going to start to look in focus. So how can you use these different aperture values to benefit your photo? If you want to take a really cool portrait of somebody and you want that really cool, crisp, sharp look where the face is really in focus but everything is blurred out, which allows you to focus more on that person's emotion, you're going to want to shoot with a lower number or a higher aperture. So somewhere in the neighborhood, if you have a lens that goes all the way down to 1.2, somewhere between 1.2 and say 3.2. That's a good range to get a really good blur behind your subject, but to make sure your subject's still in focus. Now at the other end, if you want to do sort of a landscape or a group photo, you might want to shoot with a higher number or what we call a lower aperture. So let's go with a group of 3 or 4 people, and you want to make sure all their faces are in focus. I like to start somewhere in the neighborhood of 5.6 and then work all the way up to 8 or 11. That will guarantee, or will get closer to guaranteeing, that all your friends' faces will be in focus. Now, if you want to shoot an image in nature, say that waterfall we talked about earlier, and you're stepping back and trying to capture a big scene, you might at sometimes want to go cross above f11 and go somewhere in the neighborhood of f22, f18, and that'll ensure that you can get the most of the scene in focus and very sharp and crisp detail. Now, for most of us, we probably won't need to go above f11, and that's just fine. And for a lot of nature scenes, you won't need to go above f11 either. But those are a good sort of rule of thumb of what you need to do in order to catch these different instances. So remember, the lower number will get that beautiful blur when you're taking pictures of your friends up close for portraits. The middle numbers, 5, 6 to 8, will give you good results if you're trying to get a group of people in sharp focus. And then things around f8 and above are going to give you good shots if you're trying to look for those beautiful landscapes in good focus. So the last factor on the exposure triangle is ISO. For brevity, I'm going to just call it ISO. I like to think of ISO as the weapon of last resort. It's one of the things that you want to keep as low as possible, and let me explain why. So ISO basically affects the sensitivity that your sensor has to light, meaning the higher the number, the more sensitive, meaning brighter. The lower the number, the less sensitive it is to light, so the darker the image. The reason I call this the weapon of last resort is the higher the number goes, meaning let's just say it bottoms out at 100 and it goes all the way up to 3200. The higher you make that number, the more susceptible your final image will be to digital noise. And digital noise is similar to like in the film days of having heavier grain, except unfortunately digital noise doesn't look so great. It's not black and white, it's not monochromatic. It's literally these weird colors and grainy texture to your final image. And you want to try to avoid that. So that's why shooting a lower number is always going to be better. And that's why I also call this the weapon of last resort, because if you are in a situation where there's not enough light and you've already maxed out your aperture, meaning you're shooting at a lower number, a bigger opening in your aperture, you're shooting the slowest speed you can shoot on your shutter speed in order to handhold your camera but not deal with the camera shake, then the last thing you can possibly do is affect your ISO. So if you have to move your ISO to 1600, for instance, because you're shooting inside and the light's not that great, you're going to have a noisier image than if you were shooting outside in bright daylight with an ISO at 100. So you want to be aware of those things when you're shifting around the parameters of your exposure triangle. Most cameras in 2017 will be able to shoot anywhere from 100 ISO all the way up to 6400. And I will caution you against ever maxing out the ISO. You can do it. If you're in a dire pinch and you really need to do it, you're in a really dark concert and you want to get the closing, mashup at the end, and you need to turn this on 6400 just to get that image, by all means do it and maybe try to salvage the image in retouching. But if you can avoid it, most cameras that are of this quality, you're going to be stopped out at 1600. Cheaper cameras, probably 800, but I would probably, to be safe, try to stick to a range of 1 to 400. Now, if you do end up having a really awesome camera and you have to shoot at 1600 or 3200, then we'll talk about what you can do later on in the course to clean it up in retouching. But as a happy range, when you're outside, try to keep this thing at 100 ISO. If you switch to inside, try to keep it between 400 and 800. And if you're in a dire situation, 1600 would be the max that I would push your camera to get a really nice image.